So hopefully everybody had a good lunch and you're back and ready to roll on this. So I'm excited for this first panel where we're going to be talking about opportunities to convert waste to phosphorus resources. So you can see a theme that's going on here. We're going to pick up from this morning. And we're going to have some great perspectives from our panelists today. So I'm happy to introduce Mike Schmid from Renewable Nutrients. So if we can give him a really fast round of applause. And we have Kraig Westerbeek from Smithfield Foods. And also Joseph Ziobro from US EPA. Right. Okay, so to get us started off, I thought we would go through each of our panelists, and if you guys would mind giving us a brief introduction to yourself and some of your expertise in your relationship to these issues of waste conversion and phosphorus. So Joseph, maybe we want to start on your end, and we'll let you go ahead with a brief intro.
So hello everyone, my name is Joseph Ziobro and I work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the Office of Wastewater Management, and I am in an office that does focus on implementation of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Program system for concentrated animal feeding operations in the country. However, there's a small shop of us, and I'll point to a couple of my colleagues here, Kristen and Hema sitting at the front table. We have the honor to work on a range of partnership projects where we get to work with a variety of agricultural stakeholders to develop programs that focus on not only water quality, but water quality in a way that makes both technical and economic sense for agricultural producers. So in the course of my relatively short career, I've been at EPA about 3 years now, first as a fellow and more permanently as more recently as a permanent employee. But in that short amount of time, I've really had a chance to get out on livestock operations and learn about some of the management decisions that take place on farms on a day-to-day basis. So I feel like I have that kind of nice balanced perspective of, on one hand, policy, regulations, and on the other hand, real-world needs and real-world solutions. So one of the projects that I'll be talking about in a little bit more detail today is a project called the Nutrient Recycling Challenge. And this is a project. And Brooke, do you want me to kind of dive right into that, or just kind of say hi first and then we'll get more into the...
Sure, you can go with that now.
Okay. So the Nutrient Recycling Challenge was launched a couple of years ago, and in our office there was an interest in learning about some of the technologies that Brooke and others have mentioned, some of these advanced treatment options for animal agriculture. And what we realized pretty early on in our research was there were some technology solutions out there, and I actually heard a presentation yesterday from a couple of folks at the Water, Environment, and Reuse Foundation. They came to EPA to give a little talk on their LIFT program, and kind of made the joke that there's universities that they have a lot of solutions and they're looking for problems, and then there's people in the real world who have problems and are looking for solutions, but they're not necessarily always matched up. So that was really the crux of this particular effort, was to develop a program where we bring in the perspectives of the producers and ask end users of the technologies, what would you actually like on your operations, what would make sense for you, both technically speaking and economically speaking. So we developed a program around that's essentially a prize competition that's meant to spur development of more affordable nutrient recovery technologies that are applicable for dairy and swine operations. So that launched in 2015, and we have moved through about 2 phases at this point. So we started with concepts, and we ended up getting 75 submissions from around the world. We had an expert judging panel, and we reviewed those submissions and selected 34 teams to move on into phase 2. And phase 2 was set up as a program of incubation and support, where we have been providing the innovators in the Nutrient Recycling Challenge a range of essentially informational resources and some incubation support to kind of get them thinking about, how can I not innovate in a vacuum? What are some of the real world needs, and how can I address those needs? And as we've heard many times today, more importantly, if the system is spitting out some particular product, is there a market for that product? And if not, what sort of activities can we take collectively to start tackling some of the market barriers? So in a nutshell, the Nutrient Recycling Challenge, that's the Nutrient Recycling Challenge, and I can get more into some specific aspects of it and some of the technologies a little bit later.
Perfect, thanks. Kraig, go ahead.
Thanks. I'll just stay with the introduction, Joseph, maybe. But I'm Kraig Westerbeek. I'm a vice president at Smithfield's hog production division. Smithfield Foods is the largest pork producer and processor in the world. We have farms in the United States in about 15 states, about 400 some odd company-owned farms, and then we do business with a lot of private, have contract growers or private growers as well that we do business with. Smithfield's kind of history and sustainability, I think, is well published. If you want any history on our sustainability programs, you can look online. We publish sustainability reports every year. I think one of the more exciting things, just to kind of give a broader overview of our program, we're the first animal operation that I know of that received ISO 14001 certification of our environmental management system back in 2001. And if anybody knows anything about the ISO program, it's based on, at least our EMS is based on three very important principles. One is legal compliance, another one's continuous improvement, and finally pollution prevention. So our EMS and our ISO certification really guide the way we do business at Smithfield's Hog Production Division. We're also very excited, and I don't miss an opportunity to talk about a goal we just recently set that I think is one of the first in the protein industry to reduce our carbon emissions by 25% by the year 2025. And obviously, for a company that's in the animal business, that will require us to embrace technology and do things differently on farms over time. Specific to phosphorus, you know, as I was flying here this morning, you know, I think back to when I started in the company in 1993 as an engineer out of college, and I think about the amount of phosphorus that was in our effluent that we land applied per year, per farm or per head, however you want to look at that. I think one thing in this discussion that we all have to understand is today, sitting here today, we apply 40 to 50% less phosphorus per animal or per animal unit than we did back then. And you know, how's that possible? You know, embracing things like phytase feeding, something we did a long time ago, and we've gotten better in the application of that phytase in our feed and making sure it's available to all the animals. But also just improvements in performance. You know, our feed conversion now versus what it was then, in other words, the measure of how many pounds of feed does it take to put on a pound of gain in an animal has improved by 30% over that time frame. And that has a direct relationship with the nutrients that are in the manure. So I want to get in and look forward to the discussion about how we reutilize or recycle nutrients, particularly phosphorus, because we're very excited about that opportunity. But I did want to acknowledge the improvements that had been made, at least in our business, with regards to phosphorus management over time.
Great, thank you. Mike?
So I'm Mike Schmid. I'm with a company called Renewable Nutrients. And I think we have a pretty good panel here because we've got representation from regulation, from the EPA. We've got a producer, and then Renewable Nutrients. We're on the recovery side of phosphorus. So we have a system called Quick Wash in which we recover phosphorus, and we recover phosphorus from various waste streams. We recover that phosphorus from municipal waste streams, and we help to recover phosphorus, hopefully, from agricultural waste streams. Quick Wash was developed by the United States Department of Agriculture by two soil scientists in the Agricultural Research Service. And Renewable Nutrients is a startup. We have been at this for a little over 3 years. And we recognized the value. There was a bunch of business people that came together. We recognized the value in taking this concept that came out of the USDA and commercializing it. And I think, like a lot of startups, it wasn't formed by a bunch of people who have innate knowledge of the science or the craft. They just saw the business opportunity. And I think innovation and disruption comes a lot of times from outside looking in. And, you know, we talked about looking at, early this morning, we talked about looking at these spaces instead of the trees. And I think that's how you tend to see the spaces, because if you don't see the barriers in front of you, because you're not so embedded in the science or the infrastructure or whatever that case might be, you have the ability to innovate. So USDA took this idea of recovering phosphorus. It was all about recovering phosphorus to help with animal agriculture. And our company came in and said, let's look at it a little bit differently. Where else can we recover phosphorus? And let's look at municipal waste streams, industrial waste streams, and also agricultural waste streams. So we are now in the process of commercializing quick wash in all three of those sectors.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. So I have a couple of follow-up questions for you before we open it up to our audience for questions. But Kraig, I'll start off with you. So I know you introduced us a little bit here, but would you mind telling us a little bit more about your waste management program that you have at Smithfield? And I know you have a unique perspective because you're both a producer of phosphorus and a consumer of it at the same time. And so specifically thinking about how phosphorus recovery fits into your strategic plan, perhaps now, and what would your dream goal be there?
Sure, I appreciate it. So the type of manure management system that we use on our farms is going to be dependent upon the area of the country that we do business. A lot of the states in which we do business, whether that's in the southeast or the southwest, tend to use anaerobic treatment lagoons for both primary treatment and for storage. In the upper Midwest and those areas, we would use more of a slurry-based system that's more common to that region. But you know, one thing with regards to your question is we are big purchasers of phosphorus. So we're not only producers of phosphorus, we buy a lot of phosphorus. I mean, phosphorus is critical to the growth of any living organism, and pigs are no different. So, you know, to a large degree, a lot of our phosphorus purchases are for the feed itself, but also, you know, for the row crop operations and the grain that we grow in those row crop operations, we need phosphorus as well for plant growth. Not to mention the fact that, you know, we use a lot of grain to grow these animals, and so in that grain growing process, a lot of phosphorus is purchased for the purpose of that. So in anaerobic lagoons, as an example, a lot of the phosphorus is concentrated in the sludge layer. So you have anaerobic digestion, and you have this anaerobic sludge, and so the key constituents in our sludge are concentrated there, and I feel like that's a very good thing. You know, the thing we're attacking now is how do we take that high concentrated phosphorus product and mine that in a way that's going to be beneficial. You know, when you look at that material and you are to dry and ash that product, it's going to have P2O5 concentrations of around 35%, which is extremely high when you look from a fertilizer standpoint. But also, if you look at all the minerals that are in that material in an ash form, whether that's calcium or other minerals, they're exactly what we put in the feed. So when you're in the feeding business, there's nothing really in your waste stream that you didn't put there to begin with. And so from a mineral standpoint, we think there's a lot of opportunity to mine that phosphorus. We feel like there's an opportunity to use that as a mineral supplement for the animals. Obviously, there have to be a lot of things to happen from a heat and time standpoint to make sure, and that's to put it in our feeds, a regulated activity, so we'd have to make sure we get those type of approvals. But, you know, ultimately, whether it's a fertilizer source, a high phosphorus fertilizer source, or a mineral supplement for our feed, we feel like there's a lot of opportunities there, and we feel like the economics are coming together to make that happen.
Perfect. Great. All right, Mike, I'll follow up with you. So, Mike, what do you think that some of the biggest obstacles are to effective phosphorus recovery? And these might include technical, non-technical, and how do you go about dealing with them?
Yeah, I think we have run into a couple pretty significant obstacles. One is one of those trees. It's you know, economic. I think there's a lot of trying to close this whole business model on the value of the byproduct. And I think, Kraig, you were asking me earlier, what does triple superphosphate kind of trade at right now? And it's been pretty stable at $300 a ton. You know, let's face it, nobody's going to get rich recycling phosphorus when it's trading at $300 a ton. So there has to be other elements that we're looking at beyond just the value of the recovered byproduct. There has to be other avenues that we look at that can be at least considered and somehow provided, we provide some sort of utility to it, some way of monetizing it, whether it's saving somebody money somewhere or actually selling some of that, some of the other, whatever else is recovered or what have you. So I think that's been one of the barriers. Another barrier, which is pretty significant, is nobody wants to be first. Nobody wants to be first in anything. And I think on the municipal side, we certainly see that. And one of the companies that was mentioned earlier today, in fact, we had some samples of it that were sent around the tables, is a company called Austera. And they have done a pretty good job at being one of the first in phosphorus recovery on the municipal side. And they have systems in place all over the world. But let's talk about that, systems in place all over the world. What does that necessarily mean? I think they have something like 25 or 30 installations all over the world. So how many municipal facilities do we have just in the United States alone? I think it's something like 16 or 17,000. 25 installations is a drop in the bucket. There is plenty of room in this market for a lot of different competitors. We just have to get beyond that hump of, you know, here's a new technology, but nobody wants to be first. So that's another barrier.
Great. All right, Joseph, so moving on to you. So what do you think that we can do to effectively drive implementation of phosphorus recovery, given some of these barriers that we just talked about? And what sort of role do you see regulatory frameworks playing in that?
Thanks, Brooke. So multiple responses to that, I would say. And the first thing that I would note is that with respect to the project I just mentioned, the Nutrient Recycling Challenge, we think that has promise in the sense that it considers the market forces sort of independent of regulations to some extent. I know you'll never totally divorce the two, but our hope is, at least in the project, is to encourage the kind of conversation where you can't necessarily wait for situations to arise in which all of a sudden there'll be this market and then it can be exploited and perhaps even overexploited. One thing we've heard from some producers is that technology providers will approach them and say, well, we understand you have this total daily maximum load coming into place here, so here's my technology. I know it costs more than you probably want to spend, but you got this limit to meet, so I've got a technology, you should really think about it. To us, that just sounds a little bit, unnatural and borderline predatory in some cases. We'd like to foster an environment, I think, where there's an economic incentive for the producers to explore these technologies and adopt them. And clearly, you're going to need some sort of regulatory drivers. And at a baseline, I mean, we have the stuff from the 70s, the Clean Water Act and all those important regulations. Looking forward, I think some of the more direct regulatory barriers that we would have to start having some more robust conversations about are those that surround the application, the land application of manures, and potentially, as Kraig mentioned, he's interested in exploring some options for feed additives, and of course that brings FDA into the conversation as well. So I think one of our hopes in the Nutrient Recycling Challenge is, independent of what sort of technologies get developed, there will at least be some conversation across the federal agencies that have something to do with animal agriculture, whether it be production, land application, or water quality or other environmental quality considerations. We hope this project will be a way for those conversations to start happening. What are the barriers, and potentially what can we do to take some of those down?
Excellent. Thanks. So kind of following up on a trend that we've heard repeated several times is this issue of the economic question of recovery. And I think Steve said this morning something about you can be green until you can't operate in the red, right? So our bottom line is still there. So following up on some of those themes, Curious about what you all think about what sorts of things contribute to this total value proposition. Is it phosphorus plus carbon footprints or other things that we've heard? So Mike, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, yeah, I think you mentioned one earlier today, and that is especially like in the municipal world where they're dealing with huge volumes of water that they're treating coming in on a minute-by-minute basis, where you see the buildup of struvite. And obviously, if you can eliminate the phosphorus by recovering it, that's one of the elements that you need in order to create struvite. And so, if waste treatment facilities spend in aggregate millions and millions of dollars annually combating struvite formations in their pipes and their equipment. And so if you can eliminate the formation of struvite, that eliminates a cost for them. So there is a real value right there that can be measured.
Kraig?
I think with regards to that specific question, when I look on our farms, I think we've done a pretty good job, at least on our farms in the states we do business. They have phosphorus regulations in terms of what we can land apply, how much, and they have either an indexing system or not to exceed number and those sort of things. So from balancing, and I did nutrient management plans for years. That was my job, and so I understand that part of the business. I understand balancing phosphorus. I think in many cases we've accomplished that on many of our farms. However, you have products like this digested sludge, et cetera, that has phosphorus value, and it's phosphorus value that we've already paid for one time. I mean, an animal's gut is not 100% efficient at taking all that out, but we paid for that phosphorus, whether it was already in the feedstuffs, the grain that we bought, or in the additional phosphorus that was added. And so, to me, what makes the most sense is to take that material that we're still buying today in the form of phosphorus, recycling that from our manure, and creating value with that. And we feel like there's some opportunities to do so.
Excellent. Joseph, any thoughts?
Could you just repeat that one more time?
Sure,
so
yeah.
I have it all.
Perfect. So the question is thinking about the larger value proposition. Is it phosphorus plus something else, or where can we get that from?
So I think essentially what we've heard is that without exploring some of those other avenues, such as energy recovery and thinking about integrating the systems, as things stand right now, there might not be an adequate value proposition based on the minerals alone. So to what extent we've tried to link in the folks, American biogas industry and others, into our fold, at least with respect to the nutrient recycling challenge, to think about how integrated systems could work. And one of the things that we've also started to hear a lot about is a sort of shift from a farm-based perspective solely to a project developer perspective. So if we are moving into a space where one farm isn't enough in terms of volume to get scale economies going, maybe there are some rare examples where niche markets, high-value niche markets, could make something work. However, if you could potentially link up several farms and tackle energy recovery and mineral recovery at the same time, and it's not necessarily putting all the burden on the producer, but there's a project developer, project managers, people that are very capable and adept at handling complicated anaerobic digestion and integrated systems. We're hearing grumblings that's where it could be going. So I think that could help the value proposition.
Good, thank you. So I'm going to get to audience questions here in a second, but I have one last follow-up, and it builds on Jim's question from before lunch. So I think the question is, in 10 years down the road, do you guys think that we will have 10% of our phosphorus supplies from recovered product? So anybody want to take a stab, yes or no, on this one?
Absolutely. It's all going to be coming from Quick Wash.
Good answer.
A little bit of a unique perspective. From a grain growing operation on our farms, we already get almost 100%. So that's a quick answer to that. But from a feeding standpoint, I mean, it would certainly be great if we were getting 10% from a recycled form. I think that's a heck of a goal. It would be fantastic if we could do that. And I think it's achievable.
Perfect. Joseph?
I tend to concur, and even though, as we heard, 25 facilities out of 17,000 might not be that many. There are, when I think back to 3 years ago when we started our research to where we are today, about 3 years ago with respect to livestock operations, a handful of pilot scale nutrient recovery technology systems in place, and today we're hearing about some commercial success. Even if it's limited, I think some of that trepidation that might be associated with being a first adopter of a technology has been quieted a little bit by some pretty good case studies and scale demonstrations. So I'm optimistic.
Good, we have unanimous vote, so we think it's doable. All right, so I'm going to stop asking questions there so that we have time for our audience, because we do have a great diverse perspective on our panel here. So anybody questions about opportunities to convert waste to phosphorus resources?
Hi, thanks. I'm new to this topic, so forgive me if this is a naive question, but are there any incentives at the federal or state levels to incentivize recovering phosphorus over mined phosphorus, like renewable energy credits or anything like that?
So won't speak to the states, and if anyone in the room is from the states and would like to pipe in, please do. I think at this point probably the greatest, I wouldn't necessarily say incentives so much as subsidies available in the form of various federal grant programs that could potentially fund innovative technologies and try to take away some of the risk. So especially for those early adopters, I think that's one key element. And our colleagues at USDA, both in NRCS and rural development, have a number of programs, as well as the folks at the Department of Energy, that could potentially be essentially considered a form of incentivization, at least in the form of a subsidy. Any state folks out there that would want to add a unique perspective from your particular region?
I'm from Maryland, and in Maryland we're dealing with Chesapeake Bay and looking at all different solutions to trying to reduce phosphorus and so forth. And we do have a animal waste technology fund we've been doing for about the last 4 years. About $3 million each year has been purposed for animal waste technology. We're utilizing it in poultry manure, horse manure, dairy, and hogs, and so we're working our way through that.
If I may, I would just say that we're a large branded meat company. Smithfield is. Hope you guys enjoy our products. They're fantastic. You ought to go out and buy $100 worth tonight. You'll be glad you did. We're hearing more from our customers on these type issues, and more from, when I say our customers, I mean large retailers, even the individual customers on these sorts of issues. That does, from our perspective, really mean something. It's something that we have to be cognizant of. It's not really specific to your question, but I do think that's becoming more and more of a driver for companies like ours, is listening to our customers, and if it's something that's important to them, it's important to us. I think from some of the larger fertilizer manufacturers that we've talked to, they're certainly hearing from some of the same people. And so from that standpoint, that has an impact beyond what we would normally think in terms of government incentives.
I'm Hema from EPA. I work with Joseph. Just very quickly, there is a Senate bill out. Not that EPA has any position on it, but it's Senate Bill 988 by Sherrod Brown, I think was the introducer of it. I see some nodding heads that know about it. A lot of our partners have been promoting it heavily, but it's like a 30% tax credit, I think, for nutrient recovery systems, tax incentive.
Well done, panelists. I have a purchasing question for Kraig, but before I get into that, for the person who asked about state incentives, there's a website called Desire, without the first E, DSIRE, that goes state by state and talks about credits, incentives, grant programs, et cetera. So, DSIRE, Desire. Kraig, so a purchasing question on your phosphate for feed versus grain fertigation. Do you have annual numbers on the amount of phosphorus you purchase? And if you do, or if you can answer it maybe in a follow-up question, would it be based on the 400 owned farms or the aggregate total, including all your subcontractor farms?
I don't have that number today. I'll be glad to get your card afterward and send you that information because I don't think it's a big secret. You'd have to let me know whether it want. There's phosphorus in the grain that we buy already, so that's part of the component, and then you have to supplement that. But also if you use products like phytase enzyme in pigs, that reduces substantially the amount of phosphorus. I could get you that number. On the row crop side, you know, we're users of normal, whether it's triple superphosphate or whatever type phosphorus makes sense agronomically in a given situation. We're a user of those commercial products when we have to be. In many cases on our farms, however, we would utilize the manure itself for the phosphorus that we need for those crops. And in terms of how much, whether it's just our company-owned farms or not, no, we manufacture feed not only for our company-owned farms, but also folks that contract produce for us. Yeah. I think in total for Smithfield, that's about half of their harvest, pig harvest per year.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that was the indirect question without the numbers. Was you were a purchaser for your subcontractors?
Yep,
okay,
yep.
Great. Thank you.
Be glad to get your card and get you some more information on that.
This is a question for Kraig. So IPNI has developed this really effective program, the 4 R's, for responsible fertilizer use on the crop production side. That's right. So it was a terrific effort in the fertilizer side. And one thing we've been discussing inside the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance is whether or not there's a need for or a scope for an equivalent approach for meat production, a 4R approach for poultry, hogs, or beef production. So the source of the phosphorus, the timing of it, of giving it to the right amount, and all these other things. Is there a sense of taking that same sort of approach to making sure you're doing exactly the right thing or close to exactly the right thing inside the livestock production field?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's a good question. There's opportunities in all those 4R areas, whether it's source or rate or timing or what have you, for anybody that's applying phosphorus should pay attention to those things. I would be a little bit cautious, though, that you're not repetitive of existing regulatory structures within states. And that does vary by animal species. I could go into detail, and we produce only pigs, but it does vary somewhat by species in different states and by size of the operation, et cetera, as you well know. What nutrient sensitivities they have in a given area of a state, it could even change. So I think that would be the only thing that would maybe not complicate, but that you would have to take a look at is it does vary quite a bit across the country how phosphorus is managed from a regulatory standpoint, but by and large in the states that we do business, it is addressed.
So I just want to make sure you understood my question. It wasn't on the back side, it's on the front side of the pig. So is there a need for developing guidelines and programs to make sure that the feed side of phosphorus use is maximally efficient for, so you give them just the amount that they can use to grow the best, but no more, right? And give it at the right time. Right? All those same rules.
I mean, phosphorus is pretty expensive. As we're having this discussion, understand that phosphorus is fairly expensive in the grand scheme of things, and it's also somewhat of a finite resource. So from that standpoint, I think it's somewhat self-correcting with regards to the amount of phosphorus you put in or whether you use enzymes to help reduce that or whatever. I'd be interested in talking about that because I think it's a very interesting way to do it. I also don't think there's enough emphasis on efficient production. So when I start talking about feed conversion, the amount of feed per pound of gain, understand that reduces the amount of nutrients, including phosphorus, that are excreted by the animal. So the more efficient the animal is in conversion, the better off they are. So I think you would almost better off we are from a nutrient management standpoint. And I've seen that throughout my career. I've seen the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera, excreted go down substantially. And you have to adjust for that. But to your point, I think it is something that could be brought out in that type of discussion. And, once again, there's a lot of, I think most folks do low-cost feeding or low-cost formulation feeding, but certainly be willing to talk about it because I think there may be some opportunity there.
Great. So in the interest of time, I know we have another panel coming up, so we're going to stop it there. But our panelists will be around, so I'm sure you can corner them and ask them any remaining questions that we have. So one more time, thank you, gentlemen, for taking part. Great job.